Hello. Today we're going to be talking about trauma and the gut brain axis with intergenerational trauma coach Melissa. So we're going to be waiting for her to come on. Let's see. I'm going to. Perfect. That went so much smoother than some of my last Instagram lives. I swear I'm always having like
Technical
technical. Yes.
difficulties. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. I'm so excited to chat today.
Yeah. It's good to see your beautiful face.
Oh, you too. Um, yeah. So I was hoping to go a little bit of an overview for people who like don't really understand trauma and think trauma, doesn't happen to everyone. I'm gonna give a little overview and then you can go into details because you're gonna know exactly like very specific pieces of
Yeah.
trauma, what it's gonna feel like. So I'm taking this from Embody Lab with Dr. Amy Apigian. I might be pronouncing that wrong, but I thought this was like very key information for people to think about is that trauma can occur when there's too much too soon. So think like big T trauma, something dramatic happens, it's really, just horrible. Or there's too much for too long. So that's more of that like chronic stress trauma. It could be different dynamics. It could be, ongoing abuse. It could even be emotional abuse that maybe might not seem so traumatic, but it is. Or like even being, a workaholic, or like a lot of people in the health industry end up, like myself included, end up having like medical trauma from like trying to fix your health for a decade and not getting the help that you need from people you trust. That's another of like, it's just extended on for too long, causing trauma. There is not enough for too long. So this happens again very commonly in childhood dynamics where people are not getting the they're getting neglected, they're feeling abandoned, they're not
Mm-hmm.
getting the support, the love, the guidance that they need.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really big for you because like trying to break intergenerational trauma comes with not just uh, fixing your nervous system, but being able to give back to kids and the future generations moving forward
Yep.
so that they have the resources that maybe other people don't when they go through this. And then yeah, those are like the main three things that I wanted to point out: that too much too soon, too much for too long, or not enough for too long are like the big three. So a lot of people can have some level of trauma, but you know, funny thing, I will never forget that my mother-in-law said, and I might have mentioned it maybe even talking with you before, is that you just hope that your kids or anyone has like a little fanny pack of trauma instead of suitcases that they have to walk around
Yeah.
with. But yeah,
Yeah.
so
That's so true.
can you go deeper into us like what trauma feels like? What are the different components of it? Because I know you have a lot of good information there.
Yeah. So I think of trauma, kind of like what you were just saying about, Dr. Amy, how she talks about too much too soon or too much for too long. I think of it more as like covert, and uh, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah,
uh,
take your sweet.
yeah, I'm just like overt traumas that are like, abuse,
Big stuff.
big things that big, yeah, big T traumas, or there's covert traumas, things that are not always obvious to you, in day to day life. We all experience some level of trauma. And what's really, in my experience and what I've seen in my clients and what I've learned over the years, is that what's really important is the context under which the trauma happens. So, you can have bad things happen to you, but if you have a safe and secure, environment, and you feel comforted by your parents, and you have the, tools within yourself and the external tools to cope with that trauma, then while you can certainly be knocked down, and I've heard before the term, it's a soft place to fall. So it's like, if you might fall still if you have exposure to trauma, or if you experience like a catastrophic event in your life or a death of a loved one or something like that, but you're more likely and more quickly to bounce back from that. So the context is really important. And there's a couple different things that shape that context for us, and three different things actually that and this comes from the work of Alex Howard. I follow him a lot, and he does a lot of work on trauma, and he's a trauma informed coach as well, and he talks a lot about those three things are boundaries, safety, and love. So boundaries are like our ability to say yes or no to somebody, or even ourselves, right? And knowing uh, how to say yes and no. And we learn that from our parents. We learn that it's a modeled behavior for us. And a lot of times, like, if we learn from our parents that we're not allowed to say no, like for instance, there's a common example used a lot in the trauma space that's like, if you force kids to like hug a relative, for instance, that they don't want to, they learn that they don't have control of their own boundaries. They're not allowed to impose boundaries, and then that manifests into being more difficult to implement boundaries as an adult. Or if you're like sexually abused, obviously that's a big T trauma, right? That's a huge overt trauma that and then it's also a problem with boundaries. Like you start to learn, well, I don't have control. You learn from that I don't have control of my own autonomy. I don't have, and then you don't understand how to create that boundaries in a healthy way as an adult. And then the second one is safety.
Yeah.
And safety is obviously like physical safety, right? So like you have to have, like if you grow up in a war zone or something, obviously that physical safety is something that's questioned and very difficult to overcome. Like in those times, it's in the moment, it's very challenging to regulate your emotional well-being and your nervous system and feel any sense of safety if you're in the midst of that type of environment. But the other thing is emotional safety. Right. So we get that again from our parents, and they say before the age of 7 is when that information is really imprinted into our core and into ourselves. And that is, you learn that emotional safety is learned from your parents by co-regulating with their nervous system. So, and this is where intergenerational trauma, you see this a lot, because if you have a parent like myself, I came from a chaotic, troubled household. My mother and my father both had significant traumas in their lives and their parents before them and everything. So when my parents divorced when I was really young, my mother had a very dysregulated nervous system because she had experienced her own trauma in her own young childhood, right? And she hadn't had her needs met. But then as an adult, or even as a young adult, and into her relationship with my father who abused her, she experienced more trauma. So she had a completely dysregulated nervous system. So how could she teach myself and my siblings how to regulate our nervous system? So we're learning that, before the age of 7, how to regulate our own nervous systems based on how she's acting. So when she is exposed to something stressful, the car won't start, I don't know how I'm going to pay the electric bill, or anything really, then how does she respond to that? And if, as a child, if your parent is calm and relaxed and very regulated, then you learn that our nervous system responds and regulates with that. Conversely, just what I explained, if you have a parent who is very agitated and not regulated, then you learn that, and that becomes our baseline. So as an adult now, when you have to work, overdrive to try to respond, first step is recognizing it, and some people don't. But once you do recognize it, you have to learn how to kind of, you have to flip
Right.
it and get yourself into a regulated nervous system. You have to learn that behavior as an adult, which is so much more difficult than learning it as a kid. So I'm just checking my notes to make sure I said everything. So
Language.
what's that?
It's like learning a language is very innate when you're a child, but you're basically relearning a whole new language as an adult. So you have to unlearn old
Yep.
habits and restructure the way you do things. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
if you don't mind me adding to it, it's funny that you know talked about it with boundaries and love and safety. I find with a lot of my clients that they're lacking that safety in
Mm-hmm.
themselves, and I think when you have chronic issues or health issues, you don't even have safety in your body, which it goes beyond
Yeah.
safety outside. You don't feel that safety in your body because now you have trauma from having chronic health issues. But
Yeah.
it's the same thing if you have trauma from other things. All of a sudden, you can't trust your own feelings. You don't know what's going on.
Or your own body. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. And I've watched a webinar called The Biology of Trauma by Amy, Dr. Amy again. And it was interesting because the way she described it is trauma is an unfinished stress response. So normally
Absolutely.
when you have stress, it's like you get that fight or flight or freeze. And then you do fight or flight and you fight off the stressor and then you move on and you're good to go. But then with trauma, it just never finishes because anything that triggers you keeps bringing you back. So then you raise that like stress level. You're just basically in chronic
Chronic
stress.
stress all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Your
And that
sympathetic nervous system is just firing, 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 firing.
Yes, and it's interesting the way you describe it with kids because it's so true. Because you can either teach them that like, oh, you get stressed, you manage it, and you move on,
Yeah.
or kids are not modeled that, or you're not, figuring it out. And as an adult, you end up just continuing the stress. It's like you're almost like pulling it out and making it longer because you don't know how to go back. Because you're right, you don't know boundaries and you don't feel safe, so that stress just permeates and continues.
Yep. And that's the intergenerational piece too, is like, because if your parent modeled it to you, chances are that their parent modeled it to them and their
Right.
parent before them, and really just in our generation has this even kind of really been a thing.
Right.
It's only been since the 90s that people even recognized trauma as like even a thing, right? Like, so like our grandparents were in most of our grandparents, I would say, were at least somewhat exposed to like World War II.
Yeah.
That was obviously like a big T trauma. And then the way they parented was so different from the way that the way they parented our parents was different. And then now our parents parented us, and now we're left with this trying to figure out like, wait, this isn't right. I don't feel good. I don't, if you don't have boundaries, you don't feel safe, you don't feel loved, you have a completely dysregulated nervous system, you don't know how to respond to stress, you're always up here,
Yeah.
your sympathetic nervous system's firing, firing, firing all the time, you can't cope with life, then you start having physical manifestations of problems, your whole body is imbalanced, your hormones are out of whack, your gut's all to crap, like it's just a whole cycle of dysfunction. It's insane.
That's right. And I'll go into a little
Yeah.
bit about how living in that sympathetic stress for so long does affect the gut.
Yeah.
So what happens is that you digest food when you're in parasympathetic stage. So that rest and digest when you feel relaxed, when you feel calm, and you shut off digestion and a lot of hormonal production when you're in that fight or flight. So what happens when you're in that state for a long time, first your stomach acid tends to dip, when your stomach acid tends to dip, it's harder to fight off infections. So you can start to develop infections in your gut. You also disrupt your microbiome. You might reduce the level of healthy bacteria from being under stress for so long. You let overgrowth happens of unhealthy bacteria. All of a sudden you have dysbiosis. And then on top of it, when you're stressed, you start to shed a lot of minerals. So magnesium and calcium are the first ones that come to mind, but you know, everyone's different. People might start expending different minerals. So that's why, you know, we both like testing. But when you're shedding all those minerals, then you're also not able to keep up with the function of your body. And because are important to, sorry, just got a notification on my phone, are important to run the body. So all of a sudden now you might start having, you know, constipation or diarrhea
Yep.
because you don't have sufficient minerals in your body. You might start having hormonal imbalances. You know, your thyroid might start to go. And then you're living in that cortisol. And we know that like cortisol starts to affect sleep. It can trigger anxiety. It can trigger depression. When it's for a long time, you go from having high cortisol all the time to all of a sudden your body can't produce enough and you're just living in low cortisol.
Yeah.
And that's when you get your
Adrenal
body
fatigue.
yeah, adrenaline.
Yep.
You can't get your body to go up and running. Usually that's when your thyroid takes a hit. And when you're living in that for an extended amount of time, that's when you have worsening health issues. You also are having leaky gut because all of that like starts affecting your intestinal lining. You're more prone to autoimmune disorders. You're more prone to just any illness, really.
Yeah.
So people are living in, you know, chronic stress all the time, especially if it's trauma. So it's ingrained, it's part of them. Any little stressor now feels huge to someone who didn't have that experience. It's just so much easier for their body to start breaking down. And that's when people start to have like physical manifestations. Some could be like headaches, dizziness, tightness in the chest because those minerals are getting loose. Digestive issues, constriction around the breath. That's because you're living in that sympathetic state, and when you're in the sympathetic state you you don't need as much oxygen to get going, or you know, don't quote me on that. I may be flipping around, but
Yeah.
it does affect things. And then your blood sugar starts spiking because when you're stressed you're supposed to have more blood sugar in your system to attack whatever is going on. But when that's prolonged, all of a sudden you're starting to have blood sugar issues, and it's going to be bouncing up and down. It's going to affect your vagus nerve, and everything just basically goes amok.
Yeah.
And that again goes back to affects your, you know, affects your gut, and your gut affects how much neurotransmitters you produce. So all of a sudden it becomes not just a emotional condition, it starts becoming a physical one too.
Yeah, and when you're in that, something I want to add is when you're in that fight or flight state, your body is prioritizing, you know, before you get to the point of adrenal fatigue, your body is prioritizing that cortisol production. And when you're prioritizing cortisol production, in the steroid pathway, you know, progesterone, all of our sex hormones, are your particularly progesterone is not able to be produced because you're prioritizing cortisol, and progesterone is the number one sex hormone that contributes to that feeling of calm and helps combat anxiety. So if you're all, you know, your body is prioritizing cortisol, which is making you stressed, you're in that constant state of fight or flight, which is, you know, that I feel anxious. I feel all of your blood is shunting to your core so you can run from the tiger that's not even present. And then you're also not able to produce progesterone, then you're going to feel even more anxious on top of it.
Absolutely. And low progesterone on top of it causes fertility issues, which makes sense because if you're living in chronic stress, your body's like,
you don't
now
want to be to have a baby. Yeah, I'm not trying to have a baby right now.
Yeah.
I wanted to add one more thing too. I was talking about the 3 things that you need for the trauma. Love, I didn't touch on that. So this is more than just knowing that you're loved. It's actually feeling love. And for us, as humans, like we get that feeling most when we're kids. We learn that we are lovable from our parents when we are given that quality time and attention. So like really this cannot be overstated how important it is to stop what we're doing and really just focus on our kids, really just for even a few minutes at a time. If you know, that's how we as humans feel love, for even as adults. I mean, I feel love when I have somebody's attention, when they're,
Right.
you know, paying attention to me and interacting with me. If I'm talking to somebody and they're looking the other way and they're doing something and you don't feel like they're listening, like it's really difficult to feel love in that situation, even if you know that it's somebody that does love you, like know intellectually, you know. So it's important for our parents and our primary caregivers to have that, like, genuinely be available, have time for us, and be truly interested and genuinely interested in our experience of life, and like how, you know, and not just what we want to do. So it's not like sitting down with my 8-year-old and, you know, doing something I want to do. It's like sitting down and doing something that he wants to do, getting down to his level and talking to him about his day and making him feel valued. And that's how we learn love. And as an adult, if we don't learn that, we learn that we are unlovable, or on the, you know, we can sometimes learn that we are loved only if we achieve. So
Yeah.
maybe your parents don't spend any time with you, but as soon as you bring home an A paper, they're like, "Oh, good job, son," and, you know, blah blah blah, and then you get that attention. So then you equate love with achievement, and that's how people start with those like perfectionistic, like overachiever kind of mentality, and that pushes them to eventually burnout. We should have had Vanessa on here too.
Oh, I know. I'm sure any also can relate, because that's usually what happens. You know, a lot of immigrants have, because I'm coming from an immigrant background, it's like your parents are working so hard and they're so worried that you won't succeed because going to another country is, you know, stressful. So they value achievement because they want you to do well, but then you end up stuck with that perfectionist mentality and feeling like you have to do a lot, and if you don't, that there's a problem. It's so interesting having these conversations, because then you really realize how much power we have as parents to set up our kids, not just their like mental well-being, but their physical and mental well-being. That it's so much more beyond just, you know, making sure they feel good and they're like have healthy relationships. It's really, you're setting them up for all of life just
Hi,
by
Kira.
conversation about what they like, you
Right.
know.
Absolutely. And it goes back to that intergenerational trauma. If we have that modeled experience from our parents, and they had it modeled from their parents, and before that, you know, then it's this lineage of trauma. And that you know, that reminds me too, like talking intergenerational, it's when, you know, you're exposed to, you know, your parents, your family is immigrants, and you've talked about, you know, different experiences that your grandparents
Yeah.
had in, you know, World War II and all of that. Then when you are exposed to traumas, you it creates a physical change inside of your body and can actually alter your DNA
Yeah.
and change the way your body functions. So then you pass that on genetically. The genetic expression of your genome is changed, and you're passing that on to your children, who are then left with having to deal with that, you know, intergenerational trauma that's already inside of their DNA before they've even been born.
Yeah, I see
And
that.
then on top of that, if they're also exposed to other traumas, then you're just, you know, a cascade of.
Yeah, because I've had yeah, because we're from
Hi,
a small
Jennifer.
country, and my grandparents, the stories my mom has told me, like I know more about my grandparents than she did, because some of their stories are so incredibly intense. And seeing how their stories ended up impacting my mom and changing her and her health and her mentality and how she goes about things. She's actually a beautiful, wonderful person. But I do see like the trauma that was passed down. And it is interesting because I do think there's a genetic component to it as well, because then your body breaks down under trauma. So not only are you passing down whatever is going on, you're also passing down almost like broken
Oh,
genes, which is
absolutely.
bad. But the wonderful thing is you are a coach. So what do people do when they have all these things working against them to try to not only help themselves, but help their generations moving forward, kind of break the cycle, start feeling better mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and start rebuilding those like genetic components. So because I have read that it goes both ways, right? So you can improve your genes in a lifetime, you can change them in a positive or a negative. So they do have hope, right?
Absolutely.
Moving.
Yeah, healing is possible. That's kind of like my primary
Agree with Kira that I wish this was taught in school. You have a lot.
absolutely. Yeah, you're so right, Kira. It's a complete disservice that we weren't. Everybody should be taught this, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, my key takeaway always for people is really just recognizing that like healing is possible. It doesn't ever matter what's going on inside of your body, what happened to you in your past, what happened to your parents, what trauma you've dealt with. None of that matters. What matters is that healing is possible. The first step is recognition. You have to recognize that there's a problem and do some deep soul searching and figure out, what exactly is the problem. And we do, you and I both do functional medicine lab testing. So I think one of the first steps is lab testing to see what's going on in your body, identifying the imbalances within your body. And I focus very heavily on somatic practices to help release that stored trauma. So emotion is energy in motion. So like when you have an exposure to a trauma, big T, little t, it doesn't matter. You carry that energy inside of your body. You carry that emotion unless you're dealing with it in a healthy way in real time. You're storing that emotion inside of your body. So you have to release that stored energy, that stored emotion some way. And I use somatic practices, primarily breath work and meditation. And then lifestyle, a lot of people I feel like I'm a broken record, but I do you feel like that? Because I feel like I'm a broken record sometimes.
I feel like you have to be a broken record because it always
Yeah,
goes back to some big basics and
yeah,
then little personal tweaks with the functional labs.
yeah.
Like that'll get you understanding where someone is off in their own way, but you can't ever figure out those like big pieces.
Yeah. So the lifestyle piece is, something that's always so interesting to me is I deal with clients who have a lot of personal and intergenerational trauma. So my clients feel they're very, very anxious. A lot of them are depressed, chronically fatigued, mood swings, and as a result of that, they don't want to eat well or get outside and get some vitamin D or take a walk around the block. They feel like crap.
Yeah.
They don't want to go around the block and get outside and get that fresh air. But the thing is that you have to remember how important those like staple lifestyle things are to our overall
Yeah.
health and healing journey. So like that's some of what I focus on in my program is really lifestyle modifications, recognizing being able to recognize the symptoms in your body, and then make those changes for the better. So choosing good foods that are going to fuel your body instead of crap, because if you eat crap, you're going to feel like crap.
Right.
Choosing to go walk around the block instead of drowning your sorrows in a bottle of alcohol, because that's going to make you feel better. The alcohol's not.
Right.
Or, learning the tools that you need to regulate your nervous system. So you can learn that and make that your baseline instead of the dysfunctional co-regulation that you learned when you were a kid.
It's really like learning new coping tools. And it's funny because, everyone, health, wellness, even doctors will say diet, lifestyle, but everyone's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
And I think that almost have to walk through these things because I even know like on my journey, there were times where like I did not realize how valuable just taking a walk outside is. You know what I mean? Like very simple things. And without those things, you can't fully move forward and keep, like just improving your health. But when someone's so drained and they're drowning, sometimes all they need is someone to hold their hand and walk them through it and get them not only to understand the value of the simple things and relearn how to like cope differently than what they did before, but be given the motivation that like, okay, now it's time. It's
Yeah.
time. Tomorrow you have to take a walk. Tomorrow you have to pick one thing you can eat that's good for your body and your soul, and not almost punish yourself. Because I think when you are dealing with trauma, and especially that intergenerational trauma, something, because you talked boundaries, you said safety and lack of love, those three things will make you riddled with guilt and
Oh
shame,
yeah.
and
Oh yeah.
or the lack of them.
Hmm.
And instead of figuring out how to get yourself moving forward to a healthier spot, I think a lot of people get stuck knowing what they're supposed to do. And instead of doing it, they shame and guilt themselves because they can't. So it's like that's where that piece of how can we let go of shame, guilt, and really boost that, like, I feel like emotional and physical safety first to get them to take the next step to actually bettering their
Yeah.
lives. And it's crazy how much like diving into trauma, I think, is important when trying to heal the whole person, because I think if you ignore that, a lot of times people get stuck and they won't be able to, implement all the things that we're trying to tell them to do. Because
Yeah.
it's thing, but they also have a block. They have like an emotional mental block.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that that's one of the things that's so powerful of working with a coach is like, first of all, like having that accountability, like you said, and then that being able to have somebody reflect back that sort of mindset that you're having, because like you and I know this because we've been in this space for so long, right? I've been on a healing journey for 20 years. So I know this. I know that I need to go out and take a walk because it's going to make me feel better instead of drowning my sorrows in a bottle of liquor. But like, I don't necessarily want to. I still I still like, if I'm in a bad mood or something horrible happened or something, is it like, am I like, oh yeah, like let's go take a walk? Like, like it's easier to sit in that, like stew in that and be miserable. And it's a mindset
Yeah.
shift. It really is. It's a shift of being able to recognize those things in the moment and say, okay, listen, like this is what I'm dealing with. What is going to help me? What is going to like fuel my soul and
Yeah.
my spirit, and what is
Yes.
going to nourish my body, and how can I love myself through this, rather than
Yes.
guilting and shaming and just crawling into a hole and giving up.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. It's that mindset shift of how can I like love myself into better behaviors instead of shame myself into better behaviors.
Absolutely.
Because I think we don't have that, like
That's a
that type.
We should coin that. We need to trademark that.
Yeah, we should. Who don't have that, because I've seen people in my life who didn't, who were, I was raised in like shame, guilt. That was like, that's just a Russian thing to do. So that's not even personal to me. It's like very common amongst my culture. But then you see people who didn't grow up like that, and it's so much easier for them to just do it because they're not like overthinking it. They're not like feeling bad that they can't do it. They either give themselves the rest so they can do it later, or they just do it because they know they're going to feel better. But I think when you have that trauma piece, it just keeps you stuck.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, is there any last takeaways we want to give people before closing off?
Yeah, I feel like we talked about a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
We covered a lot.
Yeah. So I'll give some summary points for anyone who is, at that tail end of it. We talked about what trauma is, and all too much too soon, that's big T trauma. Too much for too long, that chronic trauma. Not enough for too long, that's more of that abandonment, neglect. And having all that for a long amount of time, it usually means that your stress response never finishes. So you're chronic stress for a lot longer, or you keep either get triggered into it and then you are exposed to chronic stress, or you just can't get out of it because you don't have a healthy nervous system to know how to cope with it better. So when you do that for long enough, it starts to affect your gut, it starts to deplete minerals, it starts to knock your body off. And then the solution to that is recognizing that there is a mental component to what's going on, that there is probably some stress, there is probably some nervous system dysfunction, dysregulation, maybe from childhood, maybe from something else that triggered it, knocked you off balance. Recognizing the problem is step number one. Then learning how to adjust, and then also seeing what damage was done after living in that chronic stress with things like functional lab testing, things like that, and then learning tools how to now support your body moving forward. And that's diet, lifestyle, like going on walks, giving yourself some somatic practices like breath work, meditation, giving yourself self-love, finding community who gives that to you, just finding your power back, essentially, right? So there is healing, but you have to be aware of what you need healing from, right? And that you want it at all, that you want to have a different life, that you want to better yourself.
Yep. That's the first step.
Yep. All right. Anything else you want to add?
I just, like I said, my key takeaway is always just to remind people that healing is possible. It's always possible. I feel like that's something I hear so often is, people, I went to my doctor and they said it's fine, or it's all in my head, or there's nothing they can do because, they've checked my labs and they're all normal,
or you get a diagnosis and it says, oh, this is for life now. Like,
it's chronic, it's incurable. And I feel like it's just not true.
I agree.
And I don't think, I hate that we tell people that. I think anything is curable, and healing is always possible. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. This was a wonderful talk.
Yeah.
See you later.
Can't wait to do it again.
Yep.